The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's in Savannah hum at a frequency that makes Sarah Chen's teeth ache during a night shift, casting greenish shadows across linoleum floors that smell perpetually of bleach and something darker, fear, maybe, or just the accumulated weight of 8 months watching people die in increments. She moves through the ICU corridor at 11:38 p.m. with practiced invisibility, her hand steady as she adjusts for bags and checks monitors, nearly invisible among the chaos of a Level 2 trauma center where the real hierarchy has nothing to do with titles and everything to do with who breaks first when the machines start screaming. In her locker, hidden beneath folded scrubs on the bottom shelf, sit a pair of worn combat boots with Marja dust still caught in the treads despite 8 years of rain and moving and careful forgetting, the only physical reminder of who she really was, before the classified assignment, before the undercover placement that no one at this hospital knew about except the Navy liaison who'd called her at home and said simply, "We need you at St. Michael's. 1 patient. Monitor only. Tell no one." Her 12-year-old daughter, Emma, thought she worked nights because the money was better. The other nurses noticed only that she never hesitated during codes, that her fingers found veins on the first stick even when senior nurses failed after 3 attempts, that she had a thin scar running from her left wrist to elbow in a pattern too surgical to be accidental, a pattern that told stories she would never explain. Dr. Whitfield arrived for evening rounds at 6:15 p.m., his white coat crisp enough to cut, his reputation as the hospital's premier cardiothoracic surgeon preceding him like expensive cologne that cost more than Sarah made in a week. He moved through the nurses' station with the casual dominance of a man who'd never once questioned whether he belonged in a room, pausing at the central desk where Sarah reviewed charts for her assigned patient in ICU bed 412, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, age 34, Navy SEAL, recovering from shrapnel wounds sustained in an operation that the official reports called routine and the classified briefing had called a total catastrophe. Whitfield's eyes narrowed as he watched her work with a precision that moved like muscle memory through muscle memory, her competence visible in every movement, and that competence threatened the hierarchy he'd spent 15 years constructing, a hierarchy where he was apex and everyone else was prey. $5 says she quits by Friday, Whitfield said, loud enough for the entire staff lounge to hear. 12 nurses. For residents. One attending physician who'd learned long ago not to contradict Whitfield in front of an audience. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to having his cruelty accepted as humor. Look at her. Night shift. 6 months in and still hasn't figured out she's overqualified for this position. No one corrected him. No one said 8 months. Sarah was at the coffee station, pouring black coffee into a cup that read St. Michael's, where miracles happen in scrubs, and she didn't look up. Her jaw moved once, a barely perceptible clench, and then nothing, her face the blank slate of someone who'd learned in Marja that showing anger was the same as showing position, and showing position got you killed. What's the over-under on quitting? One of the younger residents asked. Fresh out of his fellowship. Eager to impress Whitfield. Still believing that cruelty was currency. I'm taking bets, Whitfield said, and he smiled like a wolf showing teeth. Anyone want to go longer? 2 weeks? A month? He leaned back against the counter with the posture of a man who'd won every argument he'd ever started. She'll be gone by the end of the week. Mark it. The coffee was bitter. Sarah could taste it even before she'd taken a sip, the flavor of standing still while someone described your failure in front of an audience that agreed through silence. She carried the cup toward the ICU, her shoes making no sound on the linoleum despite the 230 pounds she was carrying, muscle that hadn't quite converted to softness even after 8 years of civilian life, even after becoming invisible, even after learning to move like someone who had no power at all. The next morning at 7:34 a.m., during shift change when the morning staff arrived and the night staff was supposed to disappear, Sarah walked through the cafeteria with her tray. 2 scrambled eggs. 1 piece of dry toast. A cup of orange juice that cost $2.50 and tasted like regret. She was moving toward the nurse's table when Whitfield appeared from the coffee line, his tray laden with fresh fruit and eggs prepared by the dietitian who always gave him the good portions. He moved toward her with the fluid ease of someone who'd never once considered the consequences of his own actions, and his tray collided with hers with the sound of porcelain hitting tile, the crack of breaking dishes, the hiss of liquid spilling across the floor like blood pooling. Her eggs scattered. Her toes slid across the linoleum and came to rest against a chair leg. The orange juice made a slow, inexorable path toward the drain. "Oh," Whitfield said, his voice pitched to carry across the cafeteria. "How clumsy of me." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the nurses at the table behind them, at the residents watching from the beverage station, at the assembled audience that was suddenly very aware that Sarah Chen was standing in the middle of a cafeteria covered in breakfast. "You should really watch where you're putting those trays." Sarah bent down. Her movements were measured, deliberate, the kind of slow precision that required no anger because anger would have made her hands shake, and her hands did not shake. They had not shaken in Marja during the Jolin district operation when she'd pulled a 6-year-old boy from a collapsed building under heavy fire. They had not shaken during the 3-field amputation she'd performed with nothing but a combat knife and a prayer. They did not shake now as she gathered broken pottery and soaked eggs from the tile floor while Whitfield stood above her and smiled. "You might want to be more careful," he said. "This job requires attention to detail." She didn't respond. The silence was so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, could hear the distant beep of monitors from the ICU for corridors away, could hear the almost subliminal hum of the hospital's vac system pushing recycled air through vents that hadn't been cleaned since March. Sarah finished collecting the pieces of her tray. She stood up. She carried them to the trash. That was the moment the surgical resident named Chen, no relation, said quietly to the attending across the table, "That wasn't an accident." By 8:15 a.m., Sarah was back in the ICU. Bed for 12 held Lieutenant Marcus Webb, who was sleeping with the shallow breathing of someone on post-operative pain management, his chest wrapped in surgical dressings that had been changed 6 hours ago by Dr. Whitfield himself during evening rounds. Marcus's chart indicated he'd sustained shrapnel wounds to his left anterior chest wall, requiring emergency thoracotomy and repair of a lacerated subclavian artery, the kind of injury that killed most people before they reached the hospital, the kind of injury that killed most people even after they reached the hospital, the kind of injury that Marcus had survived through a combination of luck and the interventions of a field medic with 17 years of experience and hands steady as surgical lasers. Sarah pulled his chart. His vital signs were stable. Temperature 37.2 Celsius. Heart rate 78, regular. Blood pressure 118/72. Oxygen saturation 96% on 2 liters of supplemental oxygen through nasal cannula. The surgical dressings were clean. The incision showed no signs of infection. Everything was exactly as it should be in the 23rd hour after emergency surgery on a Navy SEAL whose body had been trained to survive impossible things. She didn't know yet. That was the thing that would matter later, when everything changed and the world discovered what she'd been hiding. Marcus Webb didn't know that the night nurse checking his monitors at 8:16 a.m. on a Tuesday in October was the same operator who'd carried him 3 miles through enemy fire in Marja 20 years ago, the same person whose hands had held his 6-year-old body when the building fell and the dust came and everything became impossible and then, impossibly, manageable. She adjusted his foredrip. She checked his Foley catheter. She reviewed the post-operative orders written in Whitfield's handwriting, precise, arrogant, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who'd never questioned whether his instructions would be followed. Sarah knew better. In Marja, she'd learned that the difference between surviving and dying often came down to who was paying attention in the moment when everything shifted, and she was paying attention now, her senses calibrated to the subtle changes in a patient's condition the way other people calibrated themselves to the weather. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that in exactly 6 days, everything she'd kept hidden would begin to surface, and by the time the truth emerged, she would be suspended from duty, her cover blown, her mission compromised, all because she would save Marcus Webb's life a second time, and in saving him, she would reveal a level of medical competence and training that no civilian night nurse should possess. For now, though, Sarah stood at the foot of bed 412 and looked at the man she'd rescued when he was young enough to still believe the world made sense. His vital signs remained stable. The monitors beeped their reassuring rhythm. And in her locker, hidden beneath folded scrubs on the bottom shelf, the combat boots waited for the moment when she would need to remember who she really was. The staff lounge smelled like burned coffee and ambition. Thursday morning, shift change, and the room was packed. 12 nurses clustered around the counter, for residents thumbing through charts, the fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical hymn. Dr. Whitfield stood at the coffee station in surgical scrubs still creased from the overnight bag, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, ready to crush anything in its path. "I'll bet anyone here $50, he announced, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who'd never faced consequences, that the night shift wonder quits within a week. He gestured toward Sarah with his mug, the ceramic catching light like a weapon. "She's got that look, thinks she's better than the work, better than the rest of you." His smile was the kind that showed teeth. "Give her one code where she has to bag vomit and she'll walk. Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the room like a contagion. 3 residents smiled. One nurse Sarah had helped train nodded along, complicit. Sarah continued pouring her coffee, her hand perfectly steady despite the tightness in her jaw. The muscle beneath her left eye didn't twitch. Her breathing remained even. To anyone watching, she was simply a tired night nurse, indifferent to gossip, present but not present. The watching part was the dangerous part. She'd learned that skill in Marja 20 years ago, where invisibility meant survival. The second humiliation came 4 hours later in the cafeteria during the breakfast overlap. Sarah carried her tray, oatmeal, black coffee, an apple, nothing that would make her memorable, moving through the crowded room toward an empty table. The dining area was chaos, trays clattering, conversations overlapping, the antiseptic smell of the hospital mixing with scalded eggs and burnt butter. 40 staff members were scattered across tables like targets on a range. She didn't see Whitfield extend his foot. The collision was precise, deliberate. Her tray tilted. Gravity did the rest. The oatmeal hit the tile floor in slow motion, the bowl shattering with a crack that cut through conversation like a gunshot. Coffee splashed across her scrubs. The apple rolled toward the doctor's table, coming to rest against someone's shoe. Every eye in the room pivoted toward the sound. "Oh, sweetheart, you should watch where you're going," Whitfield said, not looking up from his phone, his tone suggesting he was commenting on the weather. His colleagues laughed, not everyone, but enough. The young people always laughed. They were still learning what power looked like. Sarah knelt on the floor. Her face showed nothing. 40 pairs of eyes watched as she collected pieces of broken dishware with steady hands, each fragment placed carefully on a napkin. A young resident in his second year, he kind-faced, earnest, started to help, but Whitfield waved him back with a subtle gesture. The resident sat down, understanding the lesson he was being taught. There were sides, and one of them was with Whitfield. Sarah worked in silence. The cafeteria had resumed its noise, but something underneath it had changed, a sub-frequency that only certain people could hear. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. By 6 a.m., the night shift was ending and the morning crew was taking over. Sarah was finishing her documentation when Whitfield appeared in the ICU for rounds, 6 medical students trailing behind him like ducklings behind a swan, which was perhaps an unfair comparison to swans. He moved through the beds with the air of someone who believed the hospital existed to serve his legend. The students scribbled notes. One of them was a woman, probably 3rd year, probably excellent, probably watching what power looked like and deciding if she wanted to be that kind of doctor. Whitfield reached Marcus Webb's bed, room 412, and reviewed the chart Sarah had prepared with meticulous care. Vital signs. Medication administration. Wound assessment. Pain management. Every line printed in her steady hand, every number precise, every note clinically perfect. She stood nearby, the way nurses do, present but not imposing, ready but not presumptuous. He threw the chart at her feet. Papers scattered across the tile like snow. The medical students shifted uncomfortably, uncertain if they were witnessing teaching or cruelty. The answer, Sarah understood, was both. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his smirk a masterpiece of contempt. "And maybe learn to organize a chart properly before presenting to actual doctors." Sarah bent smoothly, her movements flowing like water, her hands beginning their work. 1 page. Another. A third. She reassembled the chart with mechanical precision, each section in its proper order, each note aligned, every detail exactly as it had been when she'd written it. Her breathing was unchanged. Her eyes were flat and distant, looking through Whitfield the way you look through window glass. She handed him the chart. "Anything else, Doctor?" He waved her away without responding. The rounds continued. The students resumed their trailing. The moment passed into the past like all the others, accumulated but not mentioned, stored in a place where time didn't move the way it did for normal people. What no one in that room knew, what no one at St. Michael's knew, was that Sarah Chen's nursing credentials were genuinely real. The degree from Johns Hopkins School of Nursing was legitimate. Her state license was current and clean. Her references were authentic. But her reason for being there, undercover in the night shift, monitoring a specific high-value patient in the ICU, was classified. Above secret. The kind of mission that required you to swallow humiliation and smile through it, because one blown cover operation could compromise assets in the field and soldiers could die. The patient was Marcus Webb, Navy SEAL, currently recovering in bed 412 from injuries sustained in an operation that had gone wrong enough that the Pentagon was personally invested in his recovery. Sarah's job was to monitor him, report his status to her handler through a phone number that existed in no official database, and make sure nothing happened to him during the healing process. Whitfield's attention was the last thing her mission needed. An investigation into her credentials, questions about her qualifications, any attention whatsoever from hospital administration, all of it a threat. Alone in the supply closet during her 7 a.m. break, Sarah gripped the edge of the sink until her knuckles went white. The metal was cold beneath her fingers, smooth and impersonal. Her reflection in the metal paper towel dispenser showed nothing, no rage, no frustration, no indication that anything had penetrated the surface. The face looking back at her was a nurse's face. Competent. Calm. Professional. The combat boots in her locker, worn leather, mud still caked in the treads from Marja, the laces double-knotted the way soldiers do it, those boots knew a different person. They knew hands that had held bleeding children. They knew eyes that had watched friends die from wounds Sarah couldn't fix. They knew the sound of mortars echoing across a valley and the weight of a rifle and the feeling of your body moving faster than your conscious mind could track, muscle memory taking over because thinking was a luxury you didn't have when survival was the only option. Those boots knew her real name, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen, 23 years of active service, Navy SEAL Command, 3 tours of Helmand Province, 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart earned in places the government wouldn't acknowledge. Marja specifically, where she'd pulled a 6-year-old boy from a collapsed building under heavy fire, where she'd earned her call sign, Angel 6, because that's what the locals called her, the one who came in the dark and pulled people back from the edge. She released the sink. Her knuckles faded from white back to their normal color. She washed her hands with surgical precision, palms, backs, between fingers, under nails, the way nurses were taught, the way soldiers had taught her, twice over. The supply closet smelled like bleach and paper and the particular scent of medical supplies, something chemical and clean and slightly wrong. She took a breath. Then another. By the time she stepped back into the ICU, the night shift was transitioning to days, and her hands were steady again, her face neutral, her voice soft and deferential when she briefed the incoming nurse on Marcus Webb's status. Vital stable, she said quietly. Pain controlled. He asked for water around 3 a.m., took some ice chips. No complications overnight. The incoming nurse nodded, scrolling through the chart Sarah had prepared, the same chart Whitfield had thrown at her feet and that she'd reassembled with perfect care. Thanks for the handoff, the nurse said. Have a good day off. Sarah gathered her things from her locker, her personal phone, her keys, the coat she'd worn in. She didn't look at the combat boots on the bottom shelf, hidden beneath folded scrubs in a color so dark blue it was almost black. But she felt them there, patient and waiting, the way equipment waits for a soldier who hasn't yet been called back to war. The smell of the locker was her smell, soap and hospital and something underneath that she couldn't name, something like memory. She closed the locker door carefully, the metal clicking shut with a finality that meant 12 hours away from St. Michael's, 12 hours where she wasn't a nurse, wasn't undercover, wasn't anything but the woman trying to figure out how to tell her 12-year-old daughter why mom was working nights, why dad didn't live with them anymore, why sometimes she woke up at 3 a.m. even when she wasn't scheduled. The morning light was starting to break through the ICU windows, pale grey bleeding toward gold. In 12 hours, she'd be back. Whitfield would still be here. Marcus Webb would still be in his bed, still recovering, still unaware that the nurse taking care of him at night was the same person who'd saved his life in a valley in Afghanistan 2 decades ago. 12 hours. She had 12 hours to be normal. Then the sun would set and the night shift would begin again, and Sarah Chen would become invisible once more, a steady competent nurse pushing a med cart through shadows, her jaw tight, her hand steady, her real boots hidden underneath scrubs at the bottom of a locker in a hospital where no one knew who she really was. But that invisibility wouldn't last much longer. In 4 nights, something would happen that would force her out of the dark, that would crack open her cover and expose her to light so bright that even Whitfield's cruelty would seem small by comparison. Tuesday night arrived like every other night, except it didn't. The ICU hummed with its usual mechanical rhythm at 2:56 a.m., ventilators breathing for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves, monitors casting their pale green glow across darkened rooms, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Sarah moved through the ward with the same invisible efficiency she'd maintained for 8 months, checking vitals, documenting outputs, existing in the spaces between other people's awareness. Marcus Webb slept in Bay 7, his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, his wounds healing with the stubborn determination of a body trained to survive. She'd checked on him at 2:51 a.m. Stable. Heart rate steady. O2 sat at 94%. Everything normal. Everything wrong. The monitor shriek came without warning. Ventricular fibrillation. The sound wasn't a beep. It was a frantic wail, the machine screaming what the body couldn't say aloud. Sarah's head snapped toward the sound before her conscious mind registered what her hands already knew. She was moving before anyone else looked up from their stations. Bay 7. She was there in 4 seconds. The room transformed in an instant. The peaceful recovery space became a battlefield. Marcus's chest heaved irregularly, his body convulsing against the restraints of consciousness as his heart fibrillated, not beating, just quivering like a trapped bird inside a cage of ribs. The monitor painted its chaotic rhythm in green light, jagged peaks that meant chaos, that meant death was already writing its arrival time on the screen. His previous surgical repair had compromised the integrity of his sternotomy closure. The stress of arrest was tearing him apart from the inside. Alarms erupted from every angle now. Code blue. The intercom crackled its automated alert. Within 90 seconds, 4 nurses and 2 residents rushed into the bay like water finding cracks, but their presence meant nothing. What mattered was what Sarah saw with absolute clarity: if Marcus Webb was dead in the next 3 minutes if conventional measures held. No medication would restart a heart already torn open from inside. No defibrillator could reset chaos at this magnitude. Her hands moved before protocol could catch up. Sterile field abandoned. She cracked open the surgical tray on the crash cart. She knew where everything lived, had watched Dr. Whitfield's surgical teams work hundreds of times, and gripped the trauma shears. The sound they made cutting through tape and dressing was like breaking glass underwater, muffled and decisive. His chest dressing came away. The scar tissue underneath still pink, still healing. The staples holding his sternotomy together glinted under the overhead lights. "What are you doing?" one of the residents asked, but his voice came from very far away. Sarah didn't answer. She'd been here before. Not in this room, not with these monitors and these fluorescent lights, but she'd been exactly here, her hands moving on autopilot, the screaming of dying men filtered through adrenaline, the clarity that came from knowing that hesitation meant caskets. Marja had burned this into her nervous system. 20 years of distance couldn't erase muscle memory. Her fingers found the space between the 2nd and 3rd rib. There. She positioned the spreader, a brutal metal instrument designed to crack open a chest, designed to reveal the organs beneath so surgeons could touch death and send it back where it came from. The sound it made engaging was like industrial machinery powering up, metallic and purposeful. 1 push. 2. The ribs parted like pages in a book. The chest wall separated, exposing the cavity beneath. Blood welled up, pooled around her gloved fingers, dripped warm and dark onto the blue surgical drape. His heart lay exposed. A useless, fibrillating thing. Quivering. Dying. Her hand plunged in without hesitation. Muscle memory took over. Pain was information, she'd learned that in combat medicine. Her fingers found the posterior left ventricle, positioned herself for direct cardiac massage, her hands closing around the heart the way a fist closes around hope. Push. Release. Push. Release. The rhythm was automatic, born from hours of training on porcine models and human cadavers, but also from something deeper, from the part of her that had held dying children and bleeding soldiers and had refused, absolutely refused, to let them slip away. The room erupted into coordinated chaos. A resident was pushing epi, shouting the dose. A nurse had the defibrillator pads off and was slapping them onto exposed tissue. The anesthesiologist was adjusting lines, talking numbers into the phone to get surgical support down from the 3rd floor. Everything moved at the speed of emergency. Everything moved around Sarah's hands, which had become the only heartbeat that mattered. 1 minute. Her hands. The heart. The faint flutter beginning to strengthen under her fingers. 90 seconds. Pace is returning, someone said. 2 minutes. O2 sat climbing. 60. 70. We're getting rhythm, the anesthesiologist called out. 2 minutes 45 seconds. Sinus rhythm. The green line on the monitor stopped its chaotic dance and settled into the regular peaks of a beating heart. Marcus Webb's heart. Beating because her hands had refused to let it stop. She didn't remove her hand immediately. She kept the pressure steady, kept the massage going, kept the rhythm alive. Only when the surgical team burst through the doors, called up from their rest, called to trauma, did she slowly, carefully, begin to withdraw her fingers from the chest cavity. The surgeon was already speaking. Get me another liter of blood ready. Type ONEG on the line. We need to repair that sternal entry before infection sets in. He was already scrubbing. Already moving. Already taking over the work that Sarah's hands had started. She stepped back. Her gloved hands were drenched in blood. It covered her wrists, soaked into the cuffs of her scrubs. The warmth was already cooling to cold. She stripped the gloves off with movements that had become automatic, dropped them into the hazardous waste bin, and turned to move out of the surgical space she'd temporarily occupied. That's when she saw him. Dr. Whitfield stood in the doorway of Bay 7, motionless. His face had gone the color of old ivory. His eyes moved from the surgeon, to the surgical team assembling, to the open chest, to Sarah's blood-soaked hands, and finally to her face. In that moment, something hardened in his expression. Not shock. Not awe. Recognition. The recognition of a hierarchy challenge he hadn't anticipated, a performance of competence that exposed the gap between his authority and actual capability. His jaw clenched. Once. Twice. His hands formed fists at his sides. Get out, he said to Sarah. His voice was quiet. Controlled. Which made it worse than shouting. Doctor, the patient is, Sarah began. Out. Now. He moved toward the surgical field, displacing her with his presence. You performed an invasive surgical procedure without authorization, without supervision, without even basic. He stopped, visibly controlling something that wanted to become fury. Get out of my ICU. She got out. By 6 a.m., Whitfield had called the hospital chairman at home. Sarah knew this because the chief nursing officer pulled her into an office at 6:44 a.m. and told her, reading from a piece of paper with Whitfield's signature at the bottom. Dr. Whitfield has expressed serious concerns about your conduct during last night's code. He's requesting an immediate investigation into your credentials and your scope of practice. The CNO's voice was sympathetic but careful, the tone of someone navigating liability. He's concerned that you may have misrepresented your training history during your hiring process. By 11 a.m., Whitfield had contacted her nursing school in Jacksonville, asking pointed questions about her clinical experience, her emergency medicine rotation, her preceptor evaluations. The nursing school director called St. Michael's personally to verify the inquiry. Within 2 hours, an investigator from the state nursing board had been contacted. Within 3 hours, an external agency had been contracted to audit Sarah's credentials. By 1:51 p.m., a meeting had been scheduled. The conference room on the 4th floor smelled like old coffee and desperation. Sarah sat on one side of a mahogany table. On the other side sat 3 people whose job it was to protect the hospital from people like her. The COO was a thin man named Harrison whose eyes never settled on anything. The chief nursing officer was a woman named Dr. Patterson, whose fingers kept fidgeting with a pen. And Dr. Whitfield, whose presence took up space the way a predator takes up space, deceptively relaxed, coiled, waiting. Sarah, the COO began, reading from prepared notes with the tone of someone reading a death warrant. We're placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a thorough investigation into your credentials and your conduct during the Code Blue event last night. Dr. Whitfield has raised several concerns that we need to address before you can continue patient care. The patient would have died, Sarah said. Her voice was flat. Factual. His chest was torn open from the surgical repair. Direct cardiac massage was the only intervention that would restart a fibrillating heart in those circumstances. Standard ACLS protocol wouldn't have. That's not the point, Whitfield interrupted, his voice smooth as silk. You performed an invasive surgical procedure without authorization, without surgical privilege, without even a physician present. You cracked open a patient's chest, Sarah. You put your hands inside a human body. That's not within the scope of nursing practice, regardless of the outcome. The outcome being that he's alive, Sarah said. The outcome being that this hospital is now potentially liable, Whitfield corrected. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, printed emails, credential verification forms. I've also requested that your nursing credentials be audited by an external credential evaluation service. Something about your skill set doesn't quite add up, and frankly, after last night's display of surgical knowledge that no standard nurse training would provide, I have questions about whether your RN credentials are what they claim to be. Sarah opened the folder. The documents were comprehensive. References contacted. Transcripts reviewed. Questions asked about her clinical rotations, her emergency medicine training, the specifics of her surgical experience. It was thorough. Professional. Destructive. You're suspended, effective now, the COO said. Security will escort you to your locker to collect personal items. You'll surrender your ID badge and your access codes. You can expect a formal notification by end of business today. She didn't argue. There was no point. They had made their decision. Whitfield had made it for them, had activated the institutional machinery with surgical precision, had turned her own performance against her with the efficiency of someone who understood exactly which buttons to push. The locker room was empty at 2:15 p.m. on a Wednesday, which meant Sarah could gather her things without witnesses. She opened her locker, the small metal space that had been her private corner of St. Michael's for 8 months, and pulled out the few items she'd kept there. A spare set of scrubs. A jacket. And at the bottom, wrapped carefully in plastic, her pair of worn combat boots. The one she'd worn in Marja 20 years ago. The one she'd pulled out of rubble when the collapse happened. The one she'd worn when she carried Marcus Webb 3 miles through enemy fire with his small body wrapped against her chest while bullets tore up the ground behind her. She wrapped them carefully in the jacket and held them against her chest. The security guard waited by the locker room entrance, professional and impersonal. He didn't meet her eyes. No one did. The invisible nurse was invisible again, but for a different reason now. The drive home took 22 minutes. She arrived at 3:03 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, a time her 12-year-old daughter Maya had never seen her arrive. The guilt of suspension hit her in waves. She'd been undercover to monitor Marcus's recovery, to ensure his safety, to collect intelligence on his operational status before the next deployment. That mission was now compromised. That mission was over. The suspension notice arrived Wednesday morning at 6:53 a.m. 48 hours. That's how long it took for everything to unravel. Sarah sat in her apartment as the sun climbed over Savannah's historic district. The official letter from St. Michael's Hospital Board of Nursing Affairs spread across her kitchen table like evidence at a crime scene. Excessive scope of practice. Unauthorized procedure. Direct cardiac massage performed without surgeon authorization. Pending investigation by the State Board of Nursing and the Department of Health Services. Administrative leave, effective immediately. Dr. Whitfield had moved fast. Fast and smart, weaponizing the system with surgical precision, calling in favors, activating his network. He'd contacted her nursing school references in Philadelphia, asking pointed questions about her credentials. He'd submitted a formal complaint to the state board before Marcus Webb's heart rate had even stabilized. He'd arranged for external investigators to audit her training records. And it had worked. By Wednesday afternoon, the hospital's legal team had sent her home. Her cover was compromised. Her mission was compromised. 12 years of placement, 14 months at St. Michael's, and 48 hours of exposure because she'd made the only choice that mattered. She'd saved a life. The phone had rung at 6:15 a.m. Her handler in Virginia. You're extracted. Pack a bag. Car picks you up at 8 a.m. She'd hung up without responding. Now, at 3:53 p.m. on that same Wednesday, Sarah pushed through the front door of her rental house in Victory Heights to find her daughter's soccer cleats thrown haphazardly on the hallway floor. Maya should be at practice. Maya was always at practice on Wednesdays. But the living room held her daughter instead, 12 years old, limbs lengthening into something that would eventually be tall, soccer uniform still damp with afternoon sweat, confusion blooming across her face. Mom? Why are you home? Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd spent 8 months at St. Michael's without a single crack in her composure, without flinching through humiliation, without letting Dr. Whitfield see anything human. But this broke something fundamental. She looked at her daughter and felt 12 years of compartmentalization begin to collapse like a structure with its load-bearing walls removed. There was a situation at work, honey. The words tasted like ash. Maya stepped closer, her instincts suddenly sharp. What situation? Mom, are you fired? Sarah couldn't lie. That was the oath she'd made to herself the moment the pregnancy test came back positive. Whatever else she did, whoever else she had to become, she would never lie to this child. This child was real. This child was the only real thing that had ever been entirely hers. I did what I had to do, Sarah said finally. And now there are consequences. She watched her daughter process this, watched the confusion deepen into something like fear. Maya's eyes were brown, warm, inherited from Sarah's mother rather than from the Navy recruiter who donated genetic material and nothing else. Those eyes now filled with concern that no 12-year-old should have to carry. Sarah's hands gripped the kitchen table's edge, and for the first time in 18 years of military service, in 8 months of undercover work, in a lifetime of holding everything together with discipline and silence, her hands shook. Not visibly. Just barely. But they shook. Did you do something wrong? Maya whispered. No. I did something right. But the wrong people don't want me doing it anymore. They stood in the afternoon sunlight slanting through the kitchen window, sunlight that should have been darkness if Sarah's life had followed its intended arc. She should be sleeping. Should be rested for the night shift. Instead, she was home at 3:36 p.m. with her daughter asking questions that couldn't be answered without breaking the most important promise she'd ever made. Maya moved to the refrigerator with the automatic motion of a child looking for something to do, something to hold, something to fix. She pulled out cheese, bread, butter. Started assembling grilled cheese sandwiches with the focused intensity of a person trying to solve an equation with their hands instead of their mind. "Mom, I heard you on the phone earlier." Maya's voice was small. "You sounded like someone else." The moment Sarah had dreaded for 12 years was happening in her kitchen at 4:12 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, happening because she'd saved a Navy SEAL's life using skills from a past her daughter didn't know she possessed, happening because compartments were failing and lies were collapsing and the woman Maya knew as her mother was only half of the truth. Before Sarah could respond, before she could construct some version of words that wasn't a lie but wasn't the truth either, her phone rang. The display read St. Michael's ER. The charge nurse's voice came through rapid and confused. "Master Chief, Sarah, we have a walk-in with chest pain requesting you specifically. Says he knows you from before. Male, 54, asking for the Night Angel. Says it's urgent." The world tilted. Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. Night Angel. No one had called her that in 20 years. No one in Savannah should know that designation. The operation in Marja was classified. The call sign was buried in archives restricted to JSOC clearance. The fact that someone was asking for her by that name meant one of three things: someone with institutional access had talked, or someone from that operation had found her, or something catastrophic had intersected her two lives in a way that shouldn't have been possible. "I'm on my way," Sarah said. "Wait, aren't you suspended?" "I'm on my way," Sarah repeated, and the voice that came out wasn't deferential. Wasn't the careful, diminished tone of the night shift nurse. Something older and harder had surfaced, something that had been dormant but never absent. Maya watched her mother move, shoes on, keys grabbed, the transformation happening in seconds. The soccer mom and the night shift nurse both evaporating, leaving something else entirely in their place. Something that moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd spent decades surviving things that killed other people. "Mom." Maya's voice cracked. "I have to go back. There's someone who needs help." "But you're suspended." "I know." Sarah paused at the door, and for just a moment, the carefully constructed mask slipped. Her daughter saw something ancient and capable and heartbroken all at once. "Some things matter more than rules, honey." The drive to St. Michael's took 7 minutes. The parking lot was normal Wednesday evening chaos, visitors coming and going, the ER bays visible through the glass atrium, the place where she'd worked every night for 14 months suddenly off limits but calling her back anyway. The charge nurse waved her through without question, 23 years of retired Marine service in Coleman's eyes, recognition that certain authority transcended paperwork. Sarah moved through the ER in civilian clothes, moving like she'd never been suspended at all, moving like the building still belonged to her. Gurney 7 held a man with weathered features, grey at the temples, clutching his chest in genuine distress. His eyes met Sarah's and went wide with recognition so absolute it was almost religious. The heart monitor showed ST elevation, the classic pattern of an anterior wall MI, but the man wasn't looking at his monitor. He was looking at her. "The Night Angel," he whispered in Pashto, then English. "You?" "Marja," the building. The room tilted sideways. Sarah's hands remained steady. Her face remained neutral. But something broke open in her chest as she recognized the man on that gurney, 20 years younger in her memory, covered in dust and blood, screaming orders as his compound collapsed under precise fire. A Taliban commander whose position she'd raided. Whose son she'd pulled from rubble while bullets sparked against concrete. "Patient needs a 12 lead, Sarah said, her voice dropping an octave. "Full cardiac panel. STEMI alert to the catheterization lab." The ER staff moved. They'd been trained to respond to authority, and something in her voice carried absolute command. But Coleman, the veteran security guard with the Marine bearing and the 23-year service record, had gone very still, watching how Sarah moved, watching her reaction, the recognition building in his weathered face like dawn breaking over water. "Mick," Coleman said slowly, his voice cutting through the organized chaos of the code, Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. The room went dead silent. The 50-year-old man's eyes snapped open the moment Sarah wheeled him into Trauma Bay 3. His face was gray, sweat pouring down temples, chest heaving against the cardiac monitor leads. But his gaze locked on hers with something beyond recognition. Something like fear. Like seeing a ghost materialize at the foot of your bed. "Night Angel," he whispered. Just 2 words. His accent was thick, Pashto underneath the English. His hand reached toward her, trembling. "You? After all these years? You're here?" Sarah's hands didn't pause. She was already checking the EKG trace, massive ST elevation in the anterior wall, the kind that meant his left anterior descending artery had locked shut minutes ago. The hiss of oxygen flowing through the mask. His blood pressure dropping. 37 minutes since symptom onset, which meant they had maybe another hour to get him into the catheterization lab before the dead zone expanded and killed the tissue forever. She didn't acknowledge his words. Just moved, professional and precise, starting the peripheral line with a smooth motion that took 2 seconds. The needle slid in like she was threading through silk. The catheter clicked into place. Blood flashed back into the chamber. She taped it down and turned to the resident. 12 lead already done. 3 minutes ago, Chief. Chief. Nobody called her that here. The room was moving now, organized chaos with purpose. 2 nurses, a cardiologist, a resident, the attending from ER. The monitors beeped their electronic rhythm. Footsteps on tile. Someone called upstairs to the cath lab, ETA 15 minutes if they could get him prepped and moving in under 5. The old man's breathing was labored now, his anxiety mounting, which only made his heart work harder, which only made the infarction worse. The oxygen meter climbed from 91 to 94 as they increased the flow. And then the security guard appeared. His name was Coleman. 63 years old, retired Marine, 22 years before he'd taken the job at St. Michael's, working nights because he said he liked the quiet. He was standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame, watching Sarah work. His expression had changed. Not shock. Not quite. Something deeper. Recognition of a kind that went bone deep. He stepped into the bay slowly. His posture straightened. His chin lifted. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of military precision, the kind of voice that had given orders on 3 continents, the kind that didn't need volume because it was backed by absolute authority. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. The room froze. Not stopped, froze. The kind of silence that happens when the world tilts on its axis and everyone feels it shift. The cardiologist's pen stopped midway through a note. One of the nurses turned. The old man on the stretcher tried to sit up, eyes wide, and Sarah placed a steady hand on his shoulder without looking at him, pressing gently downward. The hand that had held him together in Marja. The hand that had compressed his sternum 60 seconds ago when he was flat and the monitor showed nothing but the absence of life. "Stand down, Coleman," Sarah said, her voice level as a horizon. "We have a patient." But Coleman didn't stand down. He stepped forward, and his eyes met hers, and whatever he saw there made him nod once, a slow acknowledgement, the kind that passes between those who've carried things no one else should have to carry. "Yes," he said. The EKG tech was still staring. The resident was staring. The attending physician opened her mouth and closed it again. Sarah didn't look at any of them. She was already moving, saline flush through the line, checking me for again, monitoring the rhythm as it continued its dangerous dance on the screen. Irregular. Too fast. Building toward something worse. "Let's move," she said to the transport team. "Get him upstairs. Cath lab standing by." They moved her patient out of the bay with practiced efficiency. The old man kept his eyes on Sarah as they wheeled him toward the elevators, his hand reaching out as if she might disappear if he blinked. And maybe to him she might. Maybe in his mind she'd died a long time ago in the rubble of Marja, and her presence here in this hospital 20 years later was the kind of impossible thing that only happens to men who've been brought back from the edge of nothing. The silence in the bay lingered for 3 more seconds after they were gone. Then someone's phone buzzed. Then another. Then the monitors picked back up their electronic conversation, and the world resumed its normal rotation, except nothing was normal anymore because one security guard with a Marine's bearing had just spoken a classified rank in the middle of a civilian emergency department. Sarah pulled off her gloves and dropped them into the biohazard waste. She could feel the eyes on her. The questions forming. The machinery of hospital gossip about to shift into overdrive. She turned to the attending. His troponin. 0.08 when we drew. Climbing. F. 42 on the echo from last month. Sarah nodded. She was already walking toward the break room, her mind already calculating the probabilities, the survival rates, the margin for error that the cardiologist upstairs was about to work with. 94 minutes was the magic number. If they could get him opened and blood flowing again inside 94 minutes, his survival rate jumped to 73%. After that, it dropped like an elevator with the cable cut. She didn't make it to the break room. Instead, there was a commotion at the ER entrance. The sound of vehicle doors slamming in sequence. Professional. Organized. The kind of arrival that meant something official had just walked into St. Michael's, and Sarah's shoulders tensed before she saw them because she already knew what that sound meant. She'd heard it 1,000 times in bases from Camp Lejeune to Camp Dwyer. The Navy Rear Admiral came through the doors with 2 officers flanking him, and he was carrying a folder. A thick folder. The kind of folder that contained things like service records and commendation logs and sealed documentation from theaters of operation most civilians didn't know existed. His eyes found Sarah immediately. Like they were aimed. "Master Chief Chen," he said, not loudly, just firmly. "We need to talk." Sarah considered the option of walking away. She considered a lot of things in the 2-second space it took her to make the decision. Then she nodded and followed him to one of the private consultation rooms, and the Admiral closed the door, and the folder opened on the table between them like an accusation. 3 bronze stars, he said, reading aloud. His voice sounded like distant thunder, restrained, controlled, but carrying absolute authority underneath. First in Fallujah, 2004. Second in Helmand, 2007. Third in Marja, 2013. He turned the page. Sarah didn't look at it. She already knew what was there. 2 purple hearts. 2005, shrapnel wound to the left shoulder. 2009, blast concussion and secondary fragmentation. He paused. And the Navy Cross. For the Marja operation. For leadership under fire. For saving 17 lives including one 6-year-old boy. The room went so quiet she could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, that electric buzz that most people filtered out, that most people never heard, but that someone who'd spent 20 years learning to notice every sound would catch immediately. The Admiral continued, "I've been trying to find you for 6 months. Your handler told me where you were. I was planning to wait until this assignment was complete. But a 50-year-old Afghan national just arrived at this hospital with an anterior MI, and he's already given us enough information to confirm his identity as Haqqani cell coordinator from the Marja region, and he specifically asked to be treated by the Night Angel because he wanted to die knowing the person who saved his life once was the same person who let him live." The Admiral's jaw tightened. "Your presence here, Chief, was not a coincidence. Your handler saw fit to place you in the path of a man you encountered 2 decades ago. And that placement just saved a Navy SEAL's life while simultaneously compromising your entire operation." Sarah's hands remained steady on the table. "How bad?" "Catastrophic," the Admiral said flatly. "Your undercover status is burned. Dr. Whitfield has already initiated contact with personnel outside this hospital. Federal investigators are being briefed as we speak. But before we move forward with your extraction, there's something you need to see." He turned the folder toward her. Inside were financial records, bank transfers, medical documentation with subtle irregularities, dosage adjustments that didn't match protocols, intervention delays for 3 specific SEAL patients over an 18-month period, including Marcus Webb. Dr. Marcus Whitfield has been systematically compromising SEAL recovery timelines, the Admiral said quietly. We believe he was being paid by his younger brother, who was dishonorably discharged from the teams 8 years ago. Revenge deployment. The brother wanted to hurt the community that rejected him, and Whitfield wanted money and ego satisfaction. Sarah's eyes closed for exactly 1 second. When they opened again, her voice had dropped an octave. When she spoke, it wasn't a question. Where is Whitfield? Administrative leave as of 6 hours ago. Federal investigators are en route to his residence. By tomorrow morning, he'll be in custody on charges of conspiracy, medical malpractice, and violations of the Espionage Act. His career is finished. But that wasn't what Sarah was asking about, and the Admiral knew it. What she was asking about was whether the man who'd humiliated her, who'd thrown her chart on the floor, who'd made that public bet about her quitting within a week, whether he would face the kind of reckoning that matched the scale of what he'd done. Whether the universe had enough justice left in it to balance the scales. The Admiral's expression told her the answer was yes. At that moment, Marcus Webb appeared in the doorway. Still weak. Still moving like his incision was made of glass. Still in his hospital gown with his verstand rolling beside him like a metal companion. But standing. Alive. His eyes found Sarah and they filled with something that looked like 18 years of missing pieces suddenly clicking into place. You came back, he said quietly. I didn't know if you were real. In Marja, I thought I was dying. I felt like I was dying. And then you were there, and your hands were steady, and you told me to hold on, and I did. I held on because you told me to. Sarah turned to face him. The composure was still there, it would always be there, but beneath it something had shifted. The part of her that had been compartmentalized, locked down, sealed away in that footlocker with the worn combat boots was unfurling like a flower after rain. You held on because you're a SEAL, she said. You would have made it without me. No, Marcus said firmly. I wouldn't have. And then when I was coding here, when my chest was failing, you were there again. Same hands. Same voice in my head telling me to hold on. You didn't just save my life twice. He stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the tears tracking down his face. You gave me a reason to believe in second chances. The Admiral cleared his throat. There's going to be a ceremony, Chief. 6 months from now. At the White House. You're being recommended for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. The citation specifically mentions your service in Marja and your actions here at St. Michael's. It will be public. Your classified service will remain classified, but your presence and your honor will be public. Sarah's hands gripped the table. The first sign of any crack in her composure. My daughter will finally understand, the Admiral said. And she'll be proud. There was a commotion outside the consultation room. Shouting. The sound of something breaking. Sarah and the Admiral and Marcus all moved toward the door simultaneously, and what they saw in the main ER was Dr. Whitfield, still in his white coat, his face contorted with something that wasn't quite rage and wasn't quite despair, being escorted out by 2 federal agents in dark suits. He caught sight of Sarah and his expression transformed into something uglier. His mouth opened like he was going to speak, was going to say something, but then his eyes traced from Sarah to the Admiral to Marcus Webb in his hospital gown, and the calculation happened in real time, the moment when he understood that every move he'd made, every bit of institutional power he'd wielded, every connection he'd cultivated, had been insufficient. That Sarah Chen wasn't a night nurse he could break. That she was something else entirely. The agents escorted him past without allowing him to speak. His mouth worked silently. The shock in his eyes was absolute. By morning, the story would be everywhere. A visitor's phone had captured the moment, Sarah with her steady hands, Marcus Webb revealing their connection, the retired Marine security guard saluting a Master Chief, the shock on Whitfield's face as he was led away. For million views within 6 hours. The hospital's phone lines collapsed under media requests. But the real destruction came from a source nobody had anticipated. Dr. Raymond Mitchell, Whitfield's medical school mentor, the Navy veteran who'd championed him for 15 years, released a public statement at 9 in the morning. "I am horrified and ashamed to learn that a physician I trained spent months humiliating and attempting to destroy the career of a decorated Navy Master Chief. I withdraw my professional endorsement. I call for immediate board review of his conduct and suspension of his medical license." The statement included stills from the viral video. Whitfield smirking. Whitfield throwing the chart. "Pick that up, sweetheart," captured in perfect clarity. The hospital board convened an emergency session. By noon, Whitfield was on administrative leave pending criminal charges. By evening, the federal investigation had expanded to include 3 other hospitals where similar patterns existed. By the following week, he was in custody, his career burning like a building with no fire exits. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood in the East Room of the White House in her Master Chief dress uniform. The blue wool was pristine. Her ribbons were precise. The worn combat boots from Marja were polished to a mirror shine, and when the president placed the medal around her neck and the room erupted in applause, she could feel those boots pulling her forward, toward the future, toward the next mission, toward the next person who would need saving. Maya sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the woman who'd raised her. And in the audience, Marcus Webb stood at attention, his chest fully healed, back on active duty, alive twice over because someone had refused to break. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story of quiet heroism and unexpected reckoning, please like, subscribe, and comment below. Tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true strength? What would you have done in Sarah's position?